Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Malu Dumim in Israel. The war goes on. Israel is clearly on the offensive and well on its way to some sort of retaking of at least the northern part of the Gaza Strip. It is unclear, at least to the likes of those not privy to internal high-level military and political discussions, what the plan is after this part of the offensive is completed, assuming it ever is. That much is being left to the uncertain future, with the hope that those who will make the crucial decisions know what they are doing. Meanwhile, the center of public concern around the world has shifted from Israeli victims and hostages to unnecessary deaths among the civilians of Gaza. While all agree that the Hamas military deliberately embeds itself among those civilians, there is great debate about what should be the fate of those very civilians. Invariably, the arguments center around the necessity of civilian deaths in the course of any war, especially one in which the civilians are used as human shields, or whether those civilians must be protected at all costs, even if it means Israel losing certain military advantages. The two sides of this debate are well known. While it is unclear how much the Hamas leadership actually cares about civilian casualties in Gaza, their supporters rally around this supposedly humanitarian concern without fail. Words like genocide and war crimes are heard everywhere, usually with some element of self-righteous preaching. The pro-Israeli side, for its part, wonders why all these moral qualms were not raised when Israel was still uncovering the dead bodies of its own citizens who were murdered in cold blood, with no distinction given to whether they were military or civilians. That, it seems, is in the past, and thus can be safely tucked away as irrelevant. What matters, apparently, is only the civilian deaths from this point on. Even in Israel, this debate is heard. While the major concern in Israel is over the fate of the 240 hostages, there is no lack of voices raising concern over the possibility of Israel being accused of or actually committing genocide. While this might sound surprising to those outside of Israel, these voices are there. They are a small minority of the population, but their voice is always magnified beyond their actual numbers. They will only grow as time goes on. What is to be done about the problem of the Gaza civilians? Should Israel ignore them as necessary collateral damage of the war? Should Israel displace them from their homes in northern Gaza because of the inevitable danger they will present in the future if they are allowed to remain there? What about the rest of the Gazans? What is the collective responsibility of these civilians who, for the most part, openly supported and continue to support Hamas? At what point do these civilians lose their coveted status of innocent? These issues were never raised during World War II and other wars, so why are they invariably such a matter of concern in Israeli wars? Why should Israel be compelled to follow the rules of war when their enemies clearly have no concern for them at all, and in fact seem to relish in violating them? Nobody knows the answers to any of these questions, but everybody has an opinion on all of them. The matter of civilian casualties, perhaps surprisingly, can be found in the Bible. Almost without exception, there is no concern whatsoever for this vexing problem. On the contrary, in the Bible and practically throughout history, civilians caught in a war zone were seen as fair game for any opposing army. Granted, we have moved on from those barbaric days, but this has been the almost universal consensus for most of human history. The single exception in the Bible appears in this week's Parsha. The Parsha is called Vayera, which means appeared. It refers to God's appearance to Avraham following his circumcision at the end of last week's Parsha. God appears to him in the opening words and then seems to fade into the background as the verses switch to three mysterious travelers who happen to pass by Avraham's tent and are invited inside for a meal. In the course of this meal, one of the travelers announces that Sarah, Avraham's wife, who was already 90 years old, had never born a child, would become pregnant and bear a son. God had already told this to Avraham at the end of the previous Parsha, so it was really only news to Sarah. Her surprising reaction was to laugh at the news and then to deny that she laughed. It seems that it was simply too much for her to handle. The story moves on to the fate of the towns around the southern end of the Dead Sea, where Abraham's nephew Lot had settled. These towns, the biggest of which were the infamous Sodom and Gomorrah, had apparently reached a no longer tolerable level of evil. Hashem told Avraham of the impending plans for these towns. They were to be destroyed. Avraham then enters into curious and unexpectedly long dialogue with Hashem about the possibility of saving them. After several rounds of what appears to be the biblical equivalent of bargaining in a Middle Eastern shuk, the discussion abruptly ends with no definitive conclusion. From here, the story goes to the actual destruction of those towns and the miraculous escape of Lot and his daughters from their midst. It was angels who intervened to save Lot, and it was angels who agreed to let him escape to a certain cave above a village where he managed to survive with his 2 daughters. In the course of their living in the cave, the daughters intoxicate their father and have sex with him, producing sons who would become the ancestors of the nearby nations of Ammon and Moab. At some point after this, Sarah gives birth to Isaac, the prophesied son. Another round of resentment springs up over the celebration of this birth between Sarah and Avram's other wife, Hagar, and her son, Yishmael. In the course of this, Avram is reluctantly coerced into driving Hagar out of the encampment once again into the wilderness. There, after facing the near death of her son by thirst, an angel appears to her, and she is shown where a well is to be found. Her son is thus saved and grows up in the wilderness to become a hunter, eventually marrying a woman from Egypt. The parsha ends with the famous story of the binding of Isaac. This strange story, which has become central to Judaism as an example of supreme dedication to God, has almost no equivalent in all of human literature. Avram is told that he must slaughter his son as an offering to God. Avram accedes to this amazing demand and embarks on a journey to the appropriate spots for the sacrificial offering. He binds Isaac upon an altar and is ready to perform the fateful act. At the last minute, an angel of Hashem intervenes and tells him to stop, for he had already proven his total fear of God, and he and his descendants would forever deserve the blessing of Hashem. So the parsha ends. Getting back to that business of Avraham bargaining with Hashem over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding villages, there are questions that must be asked. First, the puzzling nature of the bargaining. Avram starts with the possibility that there are 50 righteous people living in the area, and therefore Hashem should spare the towns for the sake of those 50. Hashem agrees to this. Avram then goes down to 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, and finally to 10. Hashem agrees to spare the towns from destruction if these various numbers of righteous people were to be found there. Avraham doesn't go down any lower than 10 for some unclear reason. Why doesn't he go all the way down to 1? Furthermore, why did he bother starting at 50 when he could have raised the possibility that there were 10 righteous individuals, which was the number he eventually ended up at? This second question is easy to answer. This was bargaining after all. This was a way to drive the bargain down to the eventual goal. But that first question is quite difficult to answer. Why did he stop at 10? He was on a roll and Hashem was agreeing to everything. Why not go all the way down to 1 person? If 10 righteous people were worthy of sparing an area from destruction, then why wasn't 1 person worthy of the same consideration? It is interesting that Avram's first attempt at pleading with Hashem over the fate of the towns revolves around an argument of divine justice. Quote, "It should be forbidden to you to do this thing, to kill a righteous person along with an evil one, so that the righteous is like the evil. It should be forbidden for you. The judge of the entire world shall not do justice." This was a matter of right and wrong, of morality. God was subject to the same rules of justice as were moral human beings. This was Avram's argument to spare those towns for the sake of those relatively small numbers of righteous people. This, in a sense, is identical to the argument used today to restrain military intervention for the sake of civilian casualties. These civilians are assumed to be, by definition, innocent and thus righteous. But Avram doesn't go down to 1 such person. He stops at 10. Why? Perhaps the answer to this question is that there are limits to even what God can tolerate. The evil in this area was rampant. Avram agreed to that. The limited number of righteous individuals could mitigate the retribution to be exacted upon the evil inhabitants, but only to a certain lower number. Once things reach that critical amount, even Avraham can no longer bargain to spare the towns. The individuals, however many there were, would have to find a way out of the evil they were living in the midst of. Either one is part of a group that has the wherewithal to withstand with the evil they live within, or they must leave. This is a difficult pill for many to swallow, especially in modern times. They sense a shortcoming in the moral logic of the equation. Why should a righteous person have to suffer for the evil of those they live amongst? There is no great answer to this question, but it is true nevertheless. Sometimes things just have to happen to rectify a great evil. Sometimes those things include the unfortunate death or suffering of those who had nothing to do with the evil. This is simply the way things are. Great evil was perpetrated by Hamas in Gaza. Whatever amount of righteous individuals are there have to do whatever it takes to extricate themselves from the destruction, just as Lot was forced to do in Sodom and Gomorrah. There are limits to how merciful Israel or any nation or even God can be in the face of evil. Sometimes the wise and only thing to do under such circumstances is to get the hell out of Dodge. Shabbat Shalom.